Hey everybody, watch this review here with a discussion on Mattel and sort of recent history and some of the things going forward. Now this is partially just to voice some of my own opinions that I've had for a while and just haven't gotten around to uploading, as well as to address a lot of the talk on the internet in response to the annual club hysteria. In particular, I guess Strident's The Saga of Matty Collectors, which I recently watched and have some opinions on as well. Now, generally speaking, as far as the clubs are concerned, I want Club Eternia to go forward. I want to last out its last 2 years, partly because it is doing something different in that we don't have He-Man collectibles being done by anybody else. I mean, yeah, there's Pop Culture Network and stuff. Not Pop Culture Network, it's Pop Shock or something. But I mean, basically, we aren't getting any articulate figures from anybody else, and we aren't likely to get any articulate figures going forward. Whereas in the case of, Mattel and DC, no matter what, they will be putting out new DC lines, and it might not quite be the same thing that we're used to, but we'll be getting stuff there. We still have DC collectibles, so it's not as big of a deal almost. Now, as a general thing, I don't really know what Mattel's been doing the past few years. They've made some really dodgy decisions at times. Now, obviously, the only people who really know whether or not their decisions are, I guess, competent or not would be the brand managers at Mattel. I mean, they're the only ones with they're the ones with the fullest picture, not the full picture, in that they have the P&Ls, they have their market research data, they know all the costs, they know a lot of the challenges, and they have the best understanding. Everybody else, such as myself, who's been talking and speculating, saying, oh, they should have done this, they should have done that, we only have parts of the data. I mean, we might have fan anecdotes, we might see what's been going on in the back end, we might know how the retailers are reacting to these things, or various talk to sculptors, I suppose, as well. Although even with sculptors and people who are sort of working on the brands, unless you're actually a brand manager, you kind of don't have the full picture anyway, because there's so much additional information out there. You're only seeing one small part of the big picture, and the big picture is what we really need to be focusing on. Now, a lot of people have been sort of going away with the usual, Mattel's ignorant, Mattel's stupid, Mattel's greedy, and all that stuff. And that's why they're sort of going ahead with like a lot of this crap. But I mean, honestly, half of it might not even be Mattel's fault. The way that the toy industry in general works is that yeah, these companies do produce the figures, but it depends who's physically buying them for the resale. In the case of like Walmart or Target, if they aren't picking up your lines, you really can't go forward with it, or at least it won't be very profitable. And I mean, no matter what, you need somebody to carry the stuff you're putting out. A perfect example might be the Hobbit figures. How many of you have seen them? Probably not a lot, because they aren't carried anywhere. Target never had them, Walmart never had them. About the only place you could have gone was Toys R Us or Amazon, or I think a few of the music stores, or like FYE and stuff like that. But in general, the line wasn't really carried well. And also, of course, the line is pretty crappy looking, but neither here nor there. And it's sort of the effect that you have on retail side. And part of that does come down to the stupidity on the retailers' parts. A perfect example would be the Green Lantern line. Now, obviously, people ordered far too much of the first wave of the Green Lantern stuff, which didn't sell, and, as such, they didn't end up getting a lot of the other stuff in. And the way that the line was sort of broken up, which I guess there is partially Mattel's fault, although part of that might have been to keep sort of Parallax's design secret and stuff. But as a result, a lot of stuff never ended up in retail. And this sort of thing happens a lot where you have toy lines where they'll buy a lot initially, then they'll either sort of distribute it poorly, or it'll sit around at warehouse or something. Then they'll figure, we have all this stock that didn't sell, let's not carry this line anymore, and they stop putting in orders. If you remember Hasbro's Transformers line, stuff with, I think the Reveal the Shield line had this problem where they sort of just stopped carrying the stuff, so the people who bought this were like all the overstockers and the discount chains who picked this up and sold it, and it sold well for them because it wasn't going into the normal stores, because the normal stores kind of didn't want it, which, I mean, obviously is a sort of serious issue on well, somebody's head at any rate. It's hard to ever know who. Although in the case of Green Lantern, the film toys, the movie masters, those are some pretty crappy looking figures. I mean, it's no small wonder that the line did inevitably fail. And in general, I think the Movie Masters line has been a colossal misstep. I wish it just didn't exist. I mean, because instead we'd have the figures going into a different format. Like, say, if they had sort of tossed into the same sort of scale as the DC Universe Classics, I mean, that might have made a bit more sense. You know, you've got more cross-compatibility there, especially considering that the pricing is sort of the same. But hey, it's just sort of speculation, but that is kind of what Hasbro is doing going forward with their Marvel Legends line. And by the way, that's another thing that kind of bugs me. Like, we as collectors, whenever we see one line doing one thing and we think some other line's doing better, we automatically sort of compare the two without really knowing what's going on with either line necessarily. If we're considering sort of the fact that the DC Universe has sort of failed at retail at this point, it's worth noting that Marvel Legends, or Hasbro's Marvel stuff, has all basically failed as well. Of course, the Marvel Universe figures are now being folded into some new Avengers line, so we'll still be getting some of them like we had been getting them, but it's under a new brand because apparently they just don't want to carry the old brand because it wasn't selling well for them, and I can sort of attest to that. Although part of that comes down to the fact that they had a SKU configuration error some time ago, and I guess they sort of ran out of space in terms of they had too many things assigned to whatever. I know, some complicated thing. I can't remember what the exact explanation was, but they had to create some SKU extension, but as a result, a lot of retailers were getting in figures they didn't necessarily want, and they couldn't sell, so I imagine that probably just basically shunted the line there in going forward. In the case of Marvel Legends, it's a little bit more confusing, considering that, at first they were just really hard to find at retail, and then eventually they started to pick up stock a bit better, but it was all sort of earlier stuff. I'm just wondering if that was sort of infrastructure problems on the behest of the retail side, or what's going on with that. Though at least part of that does come down to the sort of production runs that Hasbro's doing, considering that nobody seems to have seen some of the figures that came out and some of the running changes for the later waves. For the first wave, it was kind of weird though, because the running changes all sort of came in first. The blue Ghost Rider, the blue or Stealth Iron Man, stuff like that. And then later on, they got like the sort of standard versions. So, yeah. But yeah, in my personal opinion, Movie Masters line really doesn't need to be there. They just need to freaking do something else with it already. Especially considering, like, every time a new film comes out, we get excited figuring what new merchandise could come out for it, and then we see the Movie Master stuff, and it's always awful. I mean, even the facial likenesses are terribly off half the time. But in general, like a lot of fans, when Mattel sort of made the move to pushing these things into clubs, my initial assumption was, yeah, it's just like a for-profit move. They're just being jerks. They figure we can make more money doing continuity, and technically speaking, everything that Mattel does is continuity. They're probably the most continuity-oriented of all the toy makers at this point. And that's part of the reason why a lot of fans are getting annoyed, because their way of handling everything has been to sort of break it up. And granted, Hasbro does do this a bit as well, but they'll toss in a lot more popular characters, whereas Mattel will often sort of reserve the popular characters just so they can put out some of the less popular characters. And they've even gone the record, Scott Knightlick discussed this at some of the previous Comic Cons and stuff, where basically they have to sort of spread things out just to keep the line going as long as possible to get as many figures out as possible. Because not every character has the same amount of fan base as the big guys, so you sort of need to keep things going. And I'm trying to think what the exact word is here, but basically all their lines seem to be designed with sort of the impression things are going to last pretty much forever and they'll eventually get to everything. Which is why with Club Eternia now they're sort of concentrating a lot of the Van Demand characters and the ending waves. But in general, that really does lead to some mixed opinions in the fan community, especially when whole waves are devoted to like one specific theme, like they had the Justice Society wave. Now, whereas I don't care about Justice Society characters, and I am, of course, a cherry picker. I cherry pick the hell out of things. If I want something specific, I'll do that, but I've often fallen into the trap of buying whole waves for the build-to-figure or collect and connect in Mattel's case. But when they're doing like a whole wave of stuff that I don't really care about, including Connect and Connect I don't really care about, I can just go ahead and skip that whole wave. So that might be part of the issue. I mean, I know when I first started collecting the DC Universe Classics line, I wasn't buying full waves up until I sort of got into the whole thing for just the Collect and Connects again. I think the first wave I picked up the full thing was the Chemo wave, or I think it was either Chemo or Calabac. And that's sort of the way they have to do it, where to sort of fund these lines, they have to rely on as many people as possible, just buying everything from the line. Which is why it sort of does make sense that they want to move it to a subscription service. But, at the same time, it just seems like there have to be more efficient ways of doing this. In particular, Digital River. Oh, God. I mean, Digital River is just a mess. It's just an unbelievable mess, and it's the only way you could describe Digital River. First off, I don't know where they fulfill from, but it always costs far too much to ship, like we're talking way above the normal rates. But secondly, they don't even charge the proper tax. I mean, if you look and you notice how much they're charging you on the tax, it's never going to be what's specific to your region. I think they're fulfilling it as because they fulfill out of Canada or something, and there are all sorts of additional taxes there, maybe. But I mean, at the end of it, you're paying like an extra 30% or 40% in some cases for the figures that you get just because these costs tack on so much more to your purchase price. Which is one of the big reasons I didn't buy much last year from Club Infinite Earths, or from their signature collection, however you call it. Basically, all I got was the Poison Ivy, which, by the way, still had defects, so, they're charging us more, and still are putting out some pretty cruddy product. Although, in their defense, they did ship me a replacement, which also had some defects, but at that point, I didn't really feel like doing anything about it. And then I picked up the Platinum and Tin pack from that. I mean, Masters I did buy a bit more from, but that's neither here nor there. But I mean, in general, when you're going from paying one price and all of a sudden they want you to pay some far greater price, it sort of irks a lot of people, such as myself. Beyond that, the other sort of general issue was I just don't think that this is necessarily the best format. What I'd love to see Mattel do is go the route of a lot of the Japanese toy makers where they take pre-orders on specific products. So this way, if they're claiming, oh, we need to buy all this material in advance, if people pre-order, they put their money in, and they sort of know like a year out ahead of time, they can more accurately plan. I mean, basically, this is what Good Smile Company does. This is what Bandai of Japan does. This is what Kyoto does. Basically that's how the collector markets run in Japan. But I mean, I don't necessarily know if they could turn that model to work for the US, given that we produce sort of a lot more characters in a lot of these waves. Whereas the efforts over there are more geared towards just a handful of characters from like one property at any given time. So I mean, some of these things just don't necessarily translate. Although I think this would fix at least some of the bigger issues of the line, where it just seems like nobody seems to understand what the demand is for these figures. The Public Enemies line, for instance, the Target exclusive wave. At the end of it, a lot of the stores were having some pretty hefty clearances on the figures. At times, it was tough for people to sort of find them in stock, but later on they always seemed well stocked. So I don't know if Target must have just ordered far too many, because Target being the only distributor would have had sort of the sole say on how many were made, I would assume. But in cases with retail exclusives, you wouldn't even be able to sort of handle the sort of pre-order aspect, though. Unless, of course, it was done through the website, such as the case of Toys R Us, I believe, has had pre-orders in the past. That's sort of an interesting thing, though. Toys R Us almost never seems to get exclusives anymore. I mean, they had the 2-packs for the Masters versus DC, but that was sort of it. And even that, it's not like it's a huge deal because they're all figures that have been produced within the various lines already. It's like, what's the point? Now, one of the other things that sort of had people up in arms is the fact that some of the figures they had announced they've canceled, which is something that they sort of seem to do on a yearly basis. If you remember, the All-Stars wave was broken up. A lot of figures were sort of taken out of rotation. They didn't explain where they'd go, such as Larfreeze. Why am I not remembering how to pronounce his name right now? But he eventually ended up in Club Infinite Earths, as did Damian Wayne, which I'd immediately predicted would have happened. But as a general thing, a lot of people seem to take some sort of like personal offense to this thing. This is an example of incompetence, but it's really just a sad reality of the industry that not everything that they show or slate will make it into retail necessarily. Case of NECA, which I often bring up, they've shown quite a few things off, but eventually either sales don't sort of justify bringing it out, or maybe the time's just not right and they've left things on the shelf. The Gremlins line, particularly, Prometheus lost a few things, Bioshock lost a few things. If you look at Hasbro and the Marvel lines, they've done it too. They had a Death's Head figure on display for the Marvel Universe line a few Comic-Cons ago. That never came out. The Marvel Universe Masterworks Fin Fang Foom. It's been a hiatus. A lot of you guys don't even remember it anymore, but they had it on display. It was out there. It was been the third thing in the line, but given how poorly the other ones sort of fared, obviously it wasn't going to get made. I mean, when you have like all these Sentinels popping up in overstock retailers, it's obviously a pretty bad sign. And you'll notice too that it was mostly the variant or running change that was showing up, because the initial production run apparently must not have sold well enough at retail, so when they made the rest of them, I mean, the only people who would buy them were the overstockers apparently. But again, you can't necessarily take these things as like a promise when they have them on show. Yet a lot of people do, because they make these things with the assumption that things will be sort of great going forward. The line will prove profitable, and there's always something sort of in advance that they're willing to show, especially when a line does seem like it's sort of going well at first. But it definitely sucks. Something I definitely will fault Mattel for is just how they handled the Young Justice line. Every facet of how they handled it seemed so completely wrong. The smaller stuff, the stuff sort of intended for kids, I find less fault with, because it's hard to sort of judge reaction with that. It's sort of in the scale as their Justice League Unlimited line, which apparently they'd previously complained about having a hard time sort of selling the stuff, and that's why they eventually made those last few 3-packs or whatever, just Matty exclusives, which didn't even sell there, by the way. In case you don't take them at their word sometimes, this is a perfect time when you sort of have to, because they sold so poorly that they ended up taking those and then just tossed them over to overstock retailers, so yeah, there is occasionally some truth to the words. But in that case, I'm not sure whether or not to fault them, but in the case of larger figures, they just handled it so poorly. Especially in that they had this huge sort of display thing, which I guess because they figured it was a cartoon line, it's probably intended more for kids and what have you, but the fact that they included these huge oversized props that most of us didn't even want jacked up the price of the individual figures considerably, so they're $4 over sort of normal line at most retailers, and the normal line was already a bit too costly, so it's probably no small part in why it failed. The other issue is they just made some really baffling decisions, like they put out Sportsmaster. I mean, granted, I understand, you need some character for the people to battle, but Sportsmaster, really? I don't know, it seems sort of messed up. They should have gone with maybe a revision of a Batman Rogue or something. And then, of course, they put out the Solar Suit Superboy, which is only present for, like, what, one episode? I mean, instead of giving us the version that we did want. And then, of course, Miss Martian, who is a sort of, I guess, the first time we've seen anything like her in any of the toy lines. Also wasn't put up near the front, so because they delayed on her, she ended up not making it to line at all. And a lot of people who don't think that Mattel is sincere about some of these panic alerts and stuff about clubs going belly up if they don't get enough subscribers. That pre-order for the Superboy and the Miss Martian, which was, I think, the first or second time they've ever tried to pre-order, that did ultimately fail, even though I was sort of wondering if that might have been just a scare tactic, but it failed. I can understand why it would fail, given that it was $50 for the 2-pack, when, when you buy the other stuff at retail, it would have just been 20 and had a lot more with it, but I'm still upset about that. It still bugs me quite a bit. And then Club Actor 1 was a no-go because it never got enough stuff to go off the ground. Honestly, I was surprised that Club Infinite Earths went live at all. I just thought that, there wouldn't be enough demand for it, especially when considering that a lot of the stuff they were doing wasn't all that impressive when you sort of compare it to retail, and they're sort of gutting what they could have offered at retail to sort of stock the selection, in the case of Poison Ivy especially. And that's why I never understood, like some of these characters like Huntress, I can understand leaving Huntress out of it. Because while Huntress has had some cartoon appearances, and, she has had, I think she was in Birds of Prey too, so she's had live action appearances. I mean, at best, she's still B-card. I mean, as far as villains go, Batman, Superman's Rogue Gallery sort of ranks up the top for DC. And Poison Ivy's sort of a mainliner in there. I mean, she's been in a movie. She's starred in like almost every Batman game. She's been in almost all the Batman cartoons. Obviously, not the Scooby-Doo Mysteries one. That was just Joker and Penguin. But something like that should have definitely gone to Batman Unlimited rather than, I guess, the sort of mix of selection with that, like the Planet X Batman, which I just don't understand why people thought there would be a demand for Planet X Batman at retail. He's something they really should have put in the online club. I mean, basically anything that's more comics oriented should have gone online. Anything that's mainstream, cartoons, movies, etc., that should have been going offline. I mean, a lot of people who buy at retail don't even read comics, so, it does make more sense to keep all your mainstream selections at retail. The more obscure stuff sort of being pushed online, especially when you know that your previous rendition or configuration of the line sort of failed at retail, just for not being, I guess, mainstream enough, maybe. Well, it might have been half the reason why they sort of had this sort of weird approach with the DC Unlimited and the Batman Unlimited lines, where it's mostly renditions of just popular characters. So they might have just been sort of overcompensating too much on that part, especially when they'd pull Larfleeze. Why do I keep calling him Larfreeze? Because Larfleeze is a character who you would really only possibly know from comics. I don't think he even appeared in the Green Lantern cartoon, although I've never watched it, or correction, I haven't watched the whole thing. I did try to watch it, and it just didn't appeal to me. But I mean, in general, I'll always be upset by the loss of that Young Justice line, especially because they had maybe the coolest rendition of Beast Boy as that sort of monkey boy, which is kind of neat. But I mean, in general, it just seems like Mattel sort of doesn't know what it's doing at retail anymore. It just seems like we get a lot of sort of short-run lines. We get some lines where they just pump out too much product too quickly, and some things in between. I'm trying to remember something that they've had sort of at retail that sort of lasted. I mean, action figure-wise, and just nothing comes to mind immediately. Though I do know that they're doing pretty well with their Monster High line. but those are dolls, not action figures, so it's sort of not a big thing to debate. And actually, whenever they bring up like the whole thing where there are DC offerings being a small fish in a big pond, they cite these other lines. The problem with that sort of thinking is they could make DC into a much bigger line if they did sort of put the right thinking into it, and they put the right amount of effort into it, the right amount of promotion, all that. Although, granted, the success of these other lines is based they're going after specific niches that don't necessarily have